Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us at Startup Grind this morning. Today's event is brought to you by Spark Center in partnership with Queen's University. My name is Jim Banting. I'm the Assistant Vice Principal for Partnerships and Innovation at Queen's. The office I work for is called Queen's Partnerships and Innovation. We are part of the VP Research Office, and our mandate is to support research and innovation at the university and the surrounding community. Our office in particular looks after things like technology transfer. We field invention disclosures from researchers. We will file patents. We'll look for licensing partnerships. We are also responsible for helping drive sponsored research at the university with partnerships with industry and other stakeholders like not-for-profits and research consortia. We have a number of programs, our office does, as do many others at Queen's, to support the innovation ecosystem, to support startups, whether those be workshops, boot camps, availability of hot desk space, etc. And we have a contract group that negotiates about 1,400 research-related agreements each year at the university. A couple of programming notes before we get started today. We'd like to welcome the audience participation, so please share where you're tuning in from on the chat. If you're comfortable, please post your LinkedIn profile. I think the startup community is all about networking in many ways. So the more we can learn about the audience today, I think the better. So let's use this as a networking opportunity if we can. Before we begin, we would like to thank Spark Center's elite partners, M&P's Assurance and Accounting, M&P's Assurance and Accounting Services, Bereskin and Parr LLP, Ruffley Insurance, Finance Without Borders, Suresh Law Professional Corporation, and Spark Innovations. Also, please don't forget to stay tuned after the interview for networking. If you haven't tried networking on the Hopin platform, it's fun and an easy way and a great way to meet some new faces. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about a bio of the person we're going to be interviewing. Scott Selbie Scott is the Chief Executive Officer for a company called Theia Markerless. He holds a PhD in kinesiology from Simon Fraser University, preceded by an engineering physics degree at UBC. He co-founded Theia Markerless as a spin-off company from a parent company called C-Motion that's focused on creating the most accurate and fully mathematically observable 3D pose estimation of the human body from an array of video cameras without using any sensors or markers on the person. Scott has served as Director of Research at C-Motion Inc., holds an adjunct professor position mechanical engineering at Queen's, and the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Massachusetts. Scott's been involved in the predecessor company, C-Motion's visual 3D software, since the original technology transfer from the National Institutes of Health in 1997. So without any further ado, let's welcome Scott to the stage.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. I don't hear any echoes. We're having a bit of a challenge here trying to get started.
Yeah, we were sweating it a little bit in the warm-up where there were some technical issues. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that everything goes well. So Scott, welcome, and we're really keen to chat more about the story of Theia Markerless. So to start off, could you just give us a snapshot of Theia Markerless, what the company is, what it does, how many employees you have, those kind of things, and then we'll start diving into your background and walk through some of the steps that new entrepreneurs would go through in founding a company. Maybe we can use Theia as an example of that. So what is Theia Markerless all about?
I'm not sure I'm an example for everyone. I'll start with who. If you're someone that wants to understand the performance of a professional athlete, how they're performing, why they're different when, sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. Do they actually perform differently, or is it just different circumstances? Or if you're an athlete and you've been injured, and someone has to decide that you're going to go back on the field because you're ready and you're not going to get injured right away. And if you want to track someone for entertainment, special effects, you want your actor to fly and do things that, you can't do on the ground. Or if you're actually a surgeon and you want to know what the heck is wrong with someone, you've done surgery. Are they better? Well, as in our tagline, if you want to know something, if you want to quantify it, just measure it. That's what we do. We measure movement. And we try to measure it with the least effect on what's happening. So we don't want to attach sensors to you. We don't want to put marker balls as you've seen in the entertainment world. We don't want to put you in some goofy suit that you may feel uncomfortable in. We don't want to take you off the playing field. We just want to record you on video. And based only on the video information and a little bit of background magic, we want to determine where you are in space, how your limbs move, how fast they move, perhaps how much force they generate. And you want to do it so that you can record the other team too. One of the problems with sensors is they're time consuming, obtrusive, they get in your way. They're a darn nuisance, but you can't learn anything about the other team. You can learn something about the other team in video. So it allows you to, in the most natural environment. So for many, many years, our focus was on clinical assessment of movement. And what happens is someone comes into a room. It's a little bit intimidating. You're in a room and you're the focus of attention. And they say, take all your clothes off, walk around in your underwear. And now for about 20 minutes, I'm going to start sticking things on your body. And you're obviously getting concerned because you don't know why they're sticking these things on your patient. And then they say, stand at this line and walk normally. And nobody does. Because you can't be told to be normal. You either are or you aren't. So this technology is to find the most unobtrusive way of accurately tracking how you move, quantifying it in a way that you can analyze it. That's what we're about.
Yeah, that seems like a big step forward just in what you've described to go through the setup. So, if anybody's a video game player and plays video games, you'll see professional athletes get put in these special suits and they have the landmarking dots all over their body, and then they get videotaped, and then that eventually gets, I guess, transcribed so that, if you're playing golf, you're playing as one of the professional golfers, so to speak. I can imagine that would be light years more convenient, so to speak, just to have a video and not have to go through all that setup. So if it was in a clinical situation, I guess that would be far easier if you wanted to monitor somebody recovering from hip surgery or figuring out a baseball pitcher, whether their pitching motion might lead to needing Tommy John surgery or not with those kind of mechanics. So, at the end of the day, is this the technology? You've made it such a simple step and made it comprehensive. At least in the sports world, is this like the next generation of Moneyball where people use statistics and data? Is this going to be the next evolution of that, where people can look at
I hope
mechanics
so.
like down to the angle of arms and bones and those kind of things? Is that the ultimate goal for Theia Markerless?
Yeah, they hope so. That is, we're trying to provide the tools. So it's simple to use. We still require an array of cameras. And if you're recording in a live event, if you're going to record in Major League Baseball or Major League Basketball or pick your major league sport, you don't get to put cameras on the field. So there's some technical challenges to putting cameras where the audience is, because audiences jump up and down. So there's still some technical challenges from the user perspective, and more importantly from the player perspective. The players don't know the difference between video cameras. They could be the broadcast cameras, and they're always on broadcast cameras, so the player doesn't know we're there.
Nice.
And so we try not to influence what's going on.
Okay.
And at the same time, provide the data to the analytics guys who are just so hungry for data these days.
So is Theia's products the software plus the cameras, or your main business is selling the software and the cameras are sourced from other third parties? What's the business model at Theia?
Oh, wouldn't we like to know? That's one of the challenges.
Oh, okay.
I think most people, but certainly us, we would prefer to be a software only company. We would love it if we were responsible for the software. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it's really scalable. There's almost no difference between having 100 customers and 1 million customers if what the customers do is download the software.
Right.
So the preference is that, okay, let's just be software. But that's not realistic, because we got to have data and you have to have cameras. And if you outsource cameras, so you say, let's let someone else put this all together for us. Let's let someone be a service provider, a systems integrator that just plunks our stuff in the middle of it. Well, we get a little teeny bit of a big package. And the most important thing to us is having good data coming in. We don't get to control that. So you kind of get forced down the path of sort of a hardware company. We're sort of responsible for cameras. We're responsible for picking solutions providers carefully. And knowing full well that in the long game, we don't want to be doing it. And in the short game,
Yep.
we have no choice.
Right. So your method of data acquisition is a camera, and I'm assuming you can't just use an iPhone. There's a certain frame rate and other things you'll need to have the fidelity to do your analysis, right? So is that part of the equation you need to manage?
Yeah, the iPhone's a fantastic video image. For some things, it's just not fast enough. So if you want to record a baseball pitcher or someone hitting, there are parts of that movement, important parts of the movement, the parts where there's the most stress on the body and they might get hurt, or the parts are the hand where the ball's coming off. They're moving so fast that you can't really capture it on an iPhone. So you really do need a camera that's a little bit special, not terribly special, just special enough that it's not off the shelf. And secondly, if you want to know where something is in the world, in 3 dimensions, not just the image you see, we need to know in 3 dimensions. We need to know the axial rotation of a segment, because that's the twist that you put on the baseball. It's hard to get that from one camera. Nobody's been successful at doing that accurately in 3D. So if you want accuracy, you're still kind of stuck with an array of cameras, which is more complicated.
Fair enough.
But yeah, no, the future is all finding its way onto a phone. The question, and the question, if you're going to ask, what the question the CEO is faced with, I think it's a little silly to say it's only me. It's saying what the company's faced with is, boy, you want to get to a one camera solution, because that one camera is in everybody's pocket. And what's the best pathway there? Start with a not quite good enough solution already on the phone, or start with the most accurate solution you can get and try to get to a phone? That's the decision.
Yeah, and I assume for most scientific endeavors, if you get quality data in, you've got substrate to work with versus something that might be suboptimal. So I can imagine you'd go from erring on the side of higher quality data and then letting maybe the more consumer products catch up, because it just seems like with Moore's law and faster chips and all those kind of things that
you hope it catches up. To get fully 3D from one camera is pretty darn tough, because everybody knows there's a whole dimension you can't really see very well. So you have to infer that dimension.
Okay.
But
so Scott,
it's...
So let's go back and talk about the founding of Theia Markerless. First, one quick question. Give us a background of the name Theia Markerless. What is it? What's the meaning associated with it?
It's actually a Greek word.
Okay.
So it gets pronounced Theia. It gets pronounced Theia. It is in typical Greek mythology. It has different meanings. The one that we lock onto is the Greek goddess of sight.
Okay. And so is it Theia Markerless? What's the correct pronunciation?
I call it Theia, but I will say that we've been told that we should really change the company's name to, we should swap the letters a little bit and call it the AI.
Oh, wow. No, that'd be pretty cool. Yeah.
But we didn't think of that. So we gave it the name of the Greek goddess. And if you have to explain the name of your company, you got to figure out when to change it sooner or later.
Yeah, but that makes sense, the analogy to sight for sure. So tell us more about the story. As I understand it broadly, it actually started as a side project within your previous
Yeah.
company or your other company called C Motion. So tell us about how that
Yeah.
project got started and the journey to actually spinning it off and starting Theia as a separate
Yeah,
company.
I'll try to shorten it. The company that I'd started 25 years ago was a technology transfer from the National Institutes of Health, funded actually by the NIH as well. They were looking for a technology that was general, so that regardless of what kind of data capture you had back in those days, particularly for clinical movement, that you could process it consistently. Because they were stuck in a position where the funding agency didn't want to fund a project where data was collected at multiple sites, because different results would come from multiple sites. And that you just can't pool that very well. So we created this company. The purpose in many ways was to deal with the challenges of the old technology. The technology is you put markers on people. And the problem with that is, first of all, the putting them on requires an expert because they got to be put on in the right places. And secondly, your skin moves relative to your bones. And if we're trying to understand movement, we're trying to fit, and muscles act on bones. They don't act on the skin, they act on bones. Then we have to figure out how to track bones. So for years, we've been all these machinations to do the best job we could with this existing technology. When I was at Queen's, pretty late in the 2000s, 2015, maybe later, I got involved with a lab. Dr. Kevin Deluzio is now the Dean of Engineering at Queen's, came back to Queen's where he was a student. And Kevin and I became good friends. And so I ended up in his lab, just poking around, helping with the students. And there was one young student that was bold. I mean, the kind of person you want to help start a company with you. As an undergrad, he was willing to come up in the street and talk to me. I'm this old guy, paying for stuff, and he just, hi, sir, remember me? I ended up through my tax funding helping support his master's degree, and at the end of the master's degree, I hired him. Now I had this kid, talented, wants to do stuff, certainly wants to do something new. And I'm saying, I got this, old company. We're doing old technology. We're trying to make old stuff work. And he's humoring me for a couple of years. And finally, something magical happened in the world of artificial intelligence. Deep neural networks demonstrated that they could recognize handwriting. And that seemed unrelated to us. Except that if you can recognize letters written by anybody, you can recognize other things. For example, a part of the body. You could recognize a nose, eyes, ears, a wrist. And it wasn't long before someone said, hey, wait a minute. You can get rid of all that old technology. Maybe. Because what if a neural network could recognize those parts of the body? And that would be so fantastic. And Mark's is all on board. We were involved with another company on a project. And that project got a little derailed, certainly from our perspective. But that's how things happen. All of a sudden, we were faced with, are we going to do this or are we not going to do this? And now there's no external partner, so to speak. And Marcus goes, I want to do this. And I said, well, okay. How about we fund this and see where it goes for a couple of years? And so we were developing in-house. We were mostly I say we like, I'm just telling Marcus what I needed to do. I'm not telling him how to do it. I'm not telling him anything. We got a very good advisor come in who was a very talented young man from Queens who has I probably shouldn't advertise his name, but he just kept Marcus on track. He said, if you can do that, if you can go this direction, don't go that way. Don't turn left, don't turn right, go straight. And when you get to the next fork in the road, go left. And all of a sudden, we had something that worked. And we've got the old company that says, well, the old company's a bunch of guys who are mid-career because they've been at it for 25 years. And we got this other group of people, including now a new student, where everybody is under 30. So we have a company of mostly people over 50 and a group of people mostly under 30. And they got different paths. So we said we should spin this off. I'd like to say give these kids a chance. It sounds so patronizing. It's not true. Let's give the idea a chance. Just happens to be the young guys that are running with it.
Well, it's a fascinating story, Scott, because when you look at some of the landmarks for the lean startup methodology and others, you kind of hit on a number of points there, right? Where you've got the long tenured domain experience in the field to say, well, if we could create a technology that would get rid of markers and have this level of accuracy, and then you bring some eager, forward-looking graduate students, and sometimes graduate students can be highly motivated. Who knows what lights people's career aspirations, and solving huge problems that others seem to have not been able to solve could really play a role here. But then the idea is, you say, well, if you can make it do A, B, C, D, and E, and it sounds like you've funded it in a stepwise way to say, well, let's take this step and see if it works, and then if we get this, we make this work, and all of a sudden you've got something you can spin off. So to me, that's the classic method of starting small, doing a bunch of experiments, figuring out whether you've got something that the market's going to understand, which is the perspective you bring. You spin that off, and so now Theia was born in, what's it, around 2018, or spun out in 2018?
I think officially 2019, but
2019,
probably early
okay.
2019.
2019,
really
right.
early.
Okay, and so solving that, removing the markers from the imaging using the neural networks. How many people work at Theia? Because you're a company that's got sales. When you look at your website, you've got a nice client list there. Give us the details on the company now, number of people, etc.
It's a strange count because I haven't described the technology. I'll describe a little bit of the technology because it's necessary.
Sure.
What the real source, neural networks by themselves aren't that much. The real source of the magic is data. So you have to get data. You could buy data, maybe. You could use data that's public. You could use data that's academics often that playing around in our field. There are a set of public databases that you could use, or you could say, we're going to create this all in-house. We're going to create data because we need to have control of this data. The quality assurance is so critical. So what we have is a company where half the company does nothing but generate data for us. So we have 10 people that do nothing but look at video images and annotate video images and do quality assurance on video images. And the other 10 people are mostly engineers. And then there's the office manager and me. So it's a small core group of engineers focused exclusively on dealing with one kind of data. And it's a whole bunch of people generating data. And it's a whole bunch of relationships with universities to generate data. And when you say what distinguishes us, it's data. So our algorithms, we like to think they're better, but our output is considerably better than everyone else because we know our data is better than everyone else. I think it's quite acknowledged that worldwide, as far as this data goes, we're probably the benchmark. So now we come to an interesting business question for you. You're supposed to jump on that one. The question is our business data?
It was going to be the question I was going to jump into. So, Scott, it's probably your experience to understand, to say, if we're going to go out into the marketplace, people are going to want to understand that the analysis we do has meaning. And so you're
Yeah.
spending the, you know what I'm saying? Like you're spending the time getting the data, the positive controls. And so the analogy that immediately pops to mind is, well, you'd be not just going to the NFL Combine, taping all the players, keeping all that data yourself, and then sharing it with all the teams versus having any one individual team, right? So if you've got data on all the players, you could compare an individual and where they rank with everybody and those kind of things. So assuming, I mean, what is the answer? Are you a data company?
Oh, we're let's call it two different kinds of data. The core data, we certainly are a company. Are we a data company for collecting data on the players? No. This stems from really my background clinically, and the little bit I know about professional athletes is they're really reticent about giving away their data. Clinically, it's probably illegal.
Ah,
For a high performance athlete, who owns their data? Right now, this is a driving wedge between the players and the leagues and the associations, because right now in Major League Sports, players don't own their own data.
really?
Teams do. And if you're a player that gets traded or you decide to go somewhere as a free agent, your data doesn't necessarily follow you. So perhaps you have to think twice about leaving your team. Or you can only go somewhere that has the same kind of data.
That's a fascinating scenario to navigate, I guess, both as a player, but for you as your business. So if we go back to 2019, Theia starts. You've got 20 people plus yourself and some admin folks. That's a lean
Yeah.
organization.
Well, 20 is where we are now. In 2019, we were 4.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Okay. Right. So growing by multiples from 2019. So you've got the team. You've spun off. When did you know you had something that was going to be valuable? Like when did you know the market was going to be very receptive to this and that you'd found your first go to market vertical or field of use? When was there an aha moment, and how could you describe that for the group? Because people talk about product market fit as that's when you know you start getting traction and growing things in the marketplace. So, describe for us your go-to-market strategy and when you felt you were starting to hit that gold vein in a particular commercial space, whether it's sports or another vertical.
I try so hard not to be too revisionist at all this when I'm looking back.
Okay.
We knew that within the small initial market, so essentially C-Motion's market of clinical assessment, injury assessment, sports-related biomechanics, for which a market existed. It's not magical. For those out there, that market is about $110 million a year for everybody. It's not very big. It's not very small, but it's not very big either.
Yeah.
And in order to get that, we have to take it from the people that are already there. So the technology is already there. We got to take it from them. So we have a product that we know is the right product for that particular market. And it wasn't an aha moment for us. I think our aha moment is coming. I think there was a moment where that community was going, yeah, we've been promised this before. I'm not sure. We've been promised this before. Yeah, no, it didn't work. I've seen it. I've seen my friends. Yeah, it doesn't work. My grad students tried it. It doesn't work. Blah, 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 blah. So we had to do what was more in my nature anyway. And that is, let's go talk to the research labs. Let's define what it is we're trying to do. And that is, we're going to replace this technology. We're going to replace the existing technology. We know what our targets are. And then we need to collaborate. We have 2 research grants that we're industrial partners on at Queen's University. The purpose of those grants is really to lay the foundations for the field of clinical assessment. So what really has to happen was the universities aren't in a rush. Universities have their job to do. Graduate students have to graduate. Faculty have to teach. Stuff goes on. We need them to get publications out directly related to what we do. Does what we do work? And it was really when the 3 articles came out of Kevin DeLuzio's lab within about a year that says, hey, folks, we did this systematically. It works. It works well enough that in our lab, we've stopped using the legacy technology. And that carried, if you're going to take academics as your first market or industry or professional sports, you got to get your credibility ducks in a row. And that's what we did. So we knew it was going to change things. It took a long time to show it. And we're still having to show it. We're still having people call and say, are you sure? Are you sure? So the telling, what changed for us is we kept talking about, yeah, we can do this well enough. And we can do it, efficiently. We can do it fast. You can do more. But nobody thought of doing the obvious until one of Kevin's grad students did recently. He said, well, let's just prove that. So he took cameras, they put them on their back, they walked out onto the streets of campus, set up the cameras, and they started recording people. They had to be clever. They had QR codes that were given to students so they could sign their waivers. They had to get it all through regulatory approvals. All this stuff was done, and they demonstrated that, in 6 afternoons, a couple hours each afternoon, it was after all getting cold in December, and they collected 350 subjects for what would be considered a typical gait analysis. Now, that's more data than was collected in the gait lab in 10 years.
Wow. So clearly your technology's got an order of magnitude level of advantage over collecting data. And if you say it's all about data, and generally speaking with AI, the more data you have, the better it is at training the different models, right?
And what seems so obvious, but everybody buys in and nobody's quite sure what to do with it. And that is almost nobody gets injured. If you're looking at sports injuries, almost no athlete gets injured in a laboratory test. Because that'd be crazy. You'd never get approval to do your next subject.
Yeah, there wouldn't be many lab tests being done. That's right.
So where they get hurt is on the field. So you got to be able to collect on the field.
Wow. So music to our ears as a partnership and innovation office at the university to hear one of your primary strategies was to seek out academic experts that could help you bridge from the marker world to the markerless world. And then, to boot, you captured the imagination of some very entrepreneurial grad students that said, hey, this seems like a problem I want to tackle as my, at least initial part of my career. That seems like you've made very good use of the academic institutions. And I think you mentioned federal grant programs as well as MyTax. So I think that's an interesting example to share. And I mean, would you say that, from put words in your mouth, Scott, but those kind of things were really key to developing proof of concept and being able to do this in a stepwise fashion to give you, I don't want to say the credibility, but just to establish your technology as really the next generation and people could confidently leave the old technology behind?
Yeah, but that I'll qualify that. Absolutely, if you do it the way we did it. So if your goal is to say, let's minimize the number of investors by getting positive cash flow right now to fund what we're doing and hold on to control until we absolutely have to go out for funding, then you go into a market that's existing and you've got to establish yourself. And if you choose one that's based on credibility and it's based on testing and it's based on independent testing and based on publicly declaring your tests, academics are the way to go. That's their job, is to publicly declare their data.
Yeah, but assuming you don't want to just say this is endorsed by University X or University Y, you want the data to be in peer-reviewed journals. You want people to look at the data. You want people to scrutinize it, to say, we've repeated this so many times, please feel free to look at it because we think the data's solid. Yeah.
And you need some people with a good deal of resilience on the academic side, because when you go in to replace something, your reviewers are likely the people using that something.
Yeah,
So
which is
going
it's
through the review process was very challenging. It was at one point I thought, this is crazy. We shouldn't be doing this to any student. Make him go through review after review after review because nobody can believe him. But the end result's pretty good.
yeah, it sounds like it. So
So
talk
that was
about,
hard.
yeah, Scott, tell us a little bit about your go-to-market strategy. What you're a highly technical team, so what is your sales process, and are you the lead salesperson? What is
No,
the pathway to go to market?
I'm not the lead salesperson. I'm the lead, I don't know, cheerleader, evangelist. Take your pick. I'm the guy that ends up giving talks at conferences, giving talks like this. It's kind of new to me. I mean, and I've heard this described by so many people. I'm the same guy I was 5 years ago, but I give a lot more talks now. um, I'm not sure I'm any better at it or whatever, but the technology is just so darn cool. And so, when I'm losing track here, but the problem is this is so new to me too. I'm sure most CEOs out there are quite a bit younger than me and are going, yeah, it's all new to me too. All of this is new. There's no training for this. There's no training that says, every week you're going to go public. You're going to put your face out there every week and you're going to talk to someone. And sometimes you're going to talk science, and sometimes you're going to talk about being a CEO, and sometimes you're going to talk about how you did something, and sometimes you're just giving someone else's story, like the data that universities collect. I get to give their story over and over and over. It's really cool, but it's not. I don't know how to emulate this. I
Well,
just think
Scott,
this is what I do.
yeah, Scott, seems to me you're doing exactly what CEOs are supposed to, right? You've got the deep domain expertise, you're setting the vision, you're making sure your organization has resources, and then you're advocating in the areas that you think will make the most sense. And it sounds like you put team members in the right positions and let them go off and solve big problems. So to me, they seem to be doing quite well at it
It
as a CEO from what you've described so far.
if and of course time is the weird one here. Um, where we stand right now is absolutely fantastic. As a company, we have customers. We have a few important customers. Unfortunately, the more important they are, the less I can talk about them because of non-disclosures.
Sure.
We have the opportunity to blow out of this small market we're in, and my expertise lies in where we are. So as a CEO, and I think any founder CEO out there has to be looking over their shoulder, because at some point this company better outpace me or I've
Well,
missed.
again, I think that's also the hallmark of a good CEO to say, to constantly be asking, how big could this get, and who are the right people to be involved, and all those kind of things.
Yeah. So
So
when
you
you
talked
said
about,
earlier, oh, sorry, go ahead. My
I was
mistake.
going to say, you talked about some of your customers. There's some listed on your website. Can you talk about any of those customers that are at least listed on your website, just to give the audience a flavor for the kind of customers you're working with now?
Sure. Without putting a name on it, except that without putting a name on it, there aren't that many. The
Okay.
shoe and apparel industry,
Hmm.
the running shoe companies um, have research groups. They have research groups because they're all trying to design the best shoe, and at the very least, they're trying to convince you as a customer that they've worked very hard to define the best shoe for walking, running at 5 kilometers an hour and running at 50. I don't know. There are hundreds and hundreds of shoes out there, and they're trying to convince you that they know what's going on. They do a lot of research. And as you can imagine, a lot of that research is how people run wearing their shoes. So they all, in a sense, have been long-term customers of C Motions. They are all stepping in to be customers of Theia's. It's weird working with them. These are Fortune 500 companies that make shoes. And you go, well, the shoe industry. I talked to someone a little while ago. and I'm not into shoes really. And they said, oh, it's a $20 billion a year market.
Wow.
Well, it's not from me.
Yeah, no, I
That's a
understand.
lot of
Shoes are,
shoes.
yeah.
That's a lot of shoes. So we work with them, and they are all trying to market themselves. They're trying to get out in the world, and so they would like to take a technology that's easy to use out into the world. So it's very cool for us to say, sure, we want to help you get out in the world. Mm-hmm. In professional sports right now, I think they started, there's a lot of small tech companies that wanted to do the analytics for professional sports organizations. Mm-hmm. So we'll help you with your data. Now those companies, the NBA signed on with SAP, Microsoft, Oracle. These are the guys. These aren't small little entrepreneurs anymore. Data is a big business. And the sports are just getting going. So as soon as we open the door, and they're affected by the shoe and apparel companies because the athletes are sponsored.
Right.
So they're all kind of intermixed. So that's kind of the market that we're trying to get entrenched into. So that's the second step of our goal. The first step was, of course, the research labs. And we have research labs all over the world. We have them in hospitals. We have them in government. The third step, you said, when's our aha moment? We don't know. We don't know where the pull is going to come to say, are we a consumer product company? We're certainly 20 people are ready to be a consumer product company. Do we want to be? Or are we going to be perfectly happy being, a $200 million company, which is certainly possible within where we're sitting? Or do we want to be big? And I don't know. We talk and talk and talk and say, well, if you really want to get big, you better be scalable. And you're going to be scalable how? By having thousands of employees or by having thousands of customers with a product that's scalable that doesn't require more than 100 people to do it. Don't know.
Those are interesting scenarios. So you could picture one where to grow big, to become a unicorn, let me just call it, over $1 billion market cap, probably involves venture capitalists and a set path towards IPO or acquisition. Or it sounds like with internal product sales, you could follow a slightly different path that may be more along the lines of your $200 million example.
Yeah.
What data are you going to use to think about which path to follow? So is it do you think the pathway will become apparent, or have you got a process to follow to figure out which path you'll follow?
You mean besides arm wrestling with the board of directors?
Well, sure. I mean, that's
I think opportunity. If anything has defined my career, is that an opportunity presented itself when I needed an opportunity to present itself. So when I ended up with my first company, it was because I'd quit my previous company. When the opportunity for Theia, it was, how did I end up with these two grad students? What kind of timing led these guys that weren't even really in this field to align? What did, right from grad school, how did I end up in biomechanics? Biomechanics is what we refer to as analyzing human movement. How did I end up in biomechanics? Mm-hmm. I'll give that really short answer. That is, I'd never even heard of it. I was an average athlete that underperformed, but I tried really hard and I worked really hard at it. I really thought I could make the Olympics, but not being big enough, not being strong enough, not being tough enough. I didn't see that part. So I walk into the university to pick up a friend. And I'm walking down the hallway and he says, oh, geez, I'm early. And there's this lecture on biomechanics. And I walk in the door. And this is 1981. walk in the door, and this guy says, we now have the technology to change, to understand how athletes move. And we have the mathematical technology, arguably, to predict a better way to move. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's me. I can go in and write some equations and I'll be a better athlete. And I was without work because I really was trying to make the Olympics. I wasn't working. I was just paddling, not successfully, but I was just paddling. And my dad says, "You're just paddling. Go volunteer. Don't apply to grad school. Don't ask him. Just say you'll work for free. What can you do?" I said, "Okay." So I walked into the office of this professor, Arthur Chapman, and I said, "That was a really, 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 really neat lecture. How do I get involved?" And he pulls a book off the shelf and he said, "Come back tomorrow. If you can read that book, you can start tomorrow."
Wow.
And I went, okay. And it was a small book. It was a book written by Herbert Hadsey in 1977 that explained how you could mathematically model the human body and predict motion. And I went through and I said, well, I understand the concepts. I have no idea if I can do it, but I know what he's trying to say. And Arthur said, "I'll show you the way to the lab."
Wow, Scott, that's a compelling story. Your flashbulb moment where you see a lecture and think, wow, this is interesting. And then good lesson for entrepreneurs is, never hurts to ask and show interest and see what happens, right? I think too often people may shy away from, you got to be polite about it. You can't pester people, but just reaching out and asking and showing interest can really go a long way.
And it was just at the right time in the lab because they needed someone to do that. If they already had someone with my skills. So now I've
Yeah.
gone the other way too. There was someone that now has one of the coolest companies in the world. And I applied to do a postdoc with him, and I called him. I said, "Mark, I've been kind of afraid to ask, but I'm ready to start. I'm about to graduate. I want to do a postdoc." And he says, "Oh, Scott, I gave that away yesterday."
Oh dear.
Oh, and he does have one of the coolest companies in the world. That is Boston Dynamics right now.
Oh my, well, that's just a small company, right?
And at the time, it wasn't a company. It was just a professor at Carnegie Mellon.
Wow, fascinating.
So you can miss opportunities by sitting on them, like I have.
So Scott, obviously you've been successful a couple of times as an entrepreneur. Would you be able to distill down your success factors, for the audience listening in today? What were the takeaways that made you successful, and what were the challenges that if you had to go back and do it again, you might do a little bit differently to get to where you are today?
Well, what I think I demonstrated or required was resilience. I don't think I just never. I believed in what I did, and I never gave up. And so I believed in what everybody did around me, and just said, "You can't make me believe that this isn't worthwhile." I'd like to say there's a better phrase than resilience because that's kind of a pig-headedness. I'd like to say I was anti-fragile, but it's not quite true. Anti-fragile, for those who don't know it, you can look it up. It's that if something goes wrong, you actually get better for it. You don't just absorb it. You actually get better. I don't know that I've really been anti-fragile, but I've certainly been resilient. Just hang in there. And is that a necessary trait? I think it's one of them. I think that is part and parcel with you got to really believe what you're doing. And over time, if you keep believing what you're doing and you keep doing your best job at it and you keep telling people at it, you get credited with some integrity for digging deep, not scratching the surface. And so if you said it's resilience and integrity, I feel kind of embarrassed saying integrity because that's something that other people say. or should say, I hope they say. It's hard for you to say about yourself. Resilience you can say about yourself.
Yeah, I think those are very good examples, and it carries through in any of your interactions. So, for example, if you're talking to a sales prospect and you're sort of speaking from your core as we believe this, and 6 months from now we're going to try and do A, B, C, and D, and then you speak to the same person 6 months later and said, well, we tried A, B didn't work, so then we went to F. All those things are really important in building trust and partnerships and sales channels. I mean, would you say that's a fair observation?
Well, one of the luxuries of being in a really niche market is I really do understand those customers.
Okay.
I
Yep.
I spent many years traveling. In the early days when no one wanted C Motion to exist, the camera companies didn't because they wanted their own software. Nobody wanted me to exist, and so I would just show up in labs. I would just show up at conferences, and I always said, if I got into your lab and I got to talk to you for an hour, you are going to be a customer sooner or later. Now, now
Well,
I stick to that, except that there was one person that it took 20 years from convincing him for it actually be a customer. But yeah, I think I understand their lab. I walk in, I go, yeah, I know this lab. I know what you do
that
and what you're
yeah,
trying to do.
that's we follow Y Combinator's Paul Graham, one of the founders of Y Combinator, always says that if you're a startup, there's really two things you need to focus on: is talking to your customers and building your product, and not much else until you've really found a fit. So it sounds like your
Right.
customers inside and out, and in chatting with them and knowing them and being one yourself, I guess, as a researcher, you can you have, I guess, you don't have to call it a luxury, but you have the luxury of solving problems that you yourself had and doing research. And if those are common with others, then you're going to resonate with folks, right?
And it's a lot of good fortune to be able to be given a public platform to talk about it. So one of the things that I did, I guess, is I don't know. I see. I won't refer to the revisionist part. Um,
Right.
I also went to places in the world that people didn't go. So certainly 25 years ago, people were underserved by their universities. They didn't have access, partly language, partly other things. So I would spend time in China and Japan and Singapore. And I would show up at small universities in small towns. And I would talk to grad students. And I would say, if you take a long term view of anything related to academics, the customers are the grad students,
Yep.
not the labs
100%.
themselves. The customers are the grad students. If you convince them to use your stuff, if you convince them that they're part of a group that's changing. So this is something Theia has done. So who are our best customers? New professors, people new to their labs. Why? Because if you're new, you really should be trying to see how you're going to change the world. So if you look at Theia's customers, the median age is 38. And when those are mostly professors, those are young professors.
Early career researchers, I guess, trying to adopt the next generation technology so that when they're looking at their research, they've got the highest fidelity data and analysis they can offer, right? So new insights and
And they're not their advisor. So
right.
they need to show up and be different. So, man, we've got this thing. We've got a technology that's cool. You need something that's cool because you got to get a grant for yourself, and you got to make sure you don't look like the lab you came from, and you got to impress the dean at your new job. Or if you're one of the new people, and right now in professional sports, these biomechanics labs are all new. You got to impress some people in these major league organizations that have never heard of what you do. So you better not show up and say, I want to do the same old stuff.
Fair enough. And for those type of clients, how do you strike the balance of going in and giving them the high level message, but then being able to dive down and give the deep science domain expertise, right? So I could see you could easily go in and go drill deep down in the the science and how the AI works. So how do you strike that balance when you're bringing a new sales prospect along to say you want to start them with the Theia 101, but certainly let them know that there's some deep-rooted uh, substance
Oh,
behind the technology.
I start with it.
Start with the technology, just show an example.
I I start with the network I've got in their field and then explain why it's a network. So what have I done in that field? What analyses have I been responsible for? Who do I talk to? But I can say, if you want to talk about pitching and you're going to record data, you may have recorded with markers or sensors, but I can give you an argument for how you should talk about the shoulder. What's the shoulder doing? Shoulder's commonly injured, but how would you measure it? How would you measure what's going on at the elbow? I can get on a board and write out the equations for you. I don't usually do that anymore, but I have before.
Yeah.
I once gave an entire workshop on a not that long ago on a whiteboard because the computer didn't work. So I gave my entire talk walking on a whiteboard and saying, okay, these are the forces, these are the moments. Go through the standard shtick, but did it all on a whiteboard. It was probably one of the more fun presentations I ever gave. And sometimes you get their attention differently. I once gave a talk where all I did was, well, I arrived jet lagged and no one was there waiting for me. So I went to one of my favorite bars in a place called Salford, little rundown bar, dilapidated, paint peeling, fantastic bar. And after one beer, I thought, I don't like my talk anymore. After my second beer, I went, hey, brilliant idea, like a 3 o'clock in the morning idea. And I walked in, I gave an entire talk of all the decisions I'd made that were wrong. If I had to do them again, I wouldn't do it.
Yep. That's a powerful way to say if you've got a wrong step discarded, you're still moving forward. And when somebody is looking to partner with you, I guess that's a transparency to say, hey, we've given this some thought, we've iterated, we've looked at this from all angles, we've been self-critical, etc. Right?
Oh, and including saying flaws are still in the software. The decision was made. I can't really change them right now. Here's how I try to compensate for the fact that I goofed up. And in one case, a mistake was made and not by me, except that I adopted it. The mistake was made about 1983.
Oh boy.
So made at the NIH about how they would represent their signals. And this was a technology transfer for me 15 years after that. And I said, okay, I'll live with that too.
Yeah.
if I could go back and change one thing, that's one of the things I changed. Is like, how do we represent a signal?
Right. So Scott, let me change the topic a little bit back and talk about tech. So you mentioned AI and neural networks was one of the technologies that sort of enabled this new spin-off company. Where do you see AI and neural nets going over the next 5-10 years, and how will that impact your business?
Oh, that's loaded. For what we, in specific instances, so for what we do, for specifically taking a video image and identifying parts of the body in order to build this model, I'm not sure this approach is really going to change. So there's nothing, it's not even an interesting topic in artificial intelligence now, what we do. Because if you talk to the people at the front edge, if you go and talk to leading people in AI, they would say what you're doing is to solve problem. Okay. There are some details, like you got to have an awful lot of good data and you got to figure out how to do quality assurance. So how much data are we talking about? I think people might want to know the numbers. Right now, we recognize 100 different points on the human body. And all of those points have to be identified in an image. So you have to go into an image and identify them by pointing at them with your cursor and saying, that's a left ear. And then you have to have someone else do it, because who's going to believe the first guy? And then you can't do much more except have a third guy. So you say, well, we can't do much right now. So we'll do more images. And when we got up to about 350,000 images, then we're saying, oh, now we can go back and look at the old data. We can say, by algorithm, could we predict which annotations were good or not? So now you can do a quality assurance that's, by algorithm, numerically. And now you keep growing. So now we're at about 1 million images. 1 million images, 100 points on each image. So while the academics in artificial intelligence say it's a solved problem, it's not a solved problem to have 1 million images that are high quality. And where are we going? We think it might take 100 million to do this really well. You're not going to get to 100 million by having a group of 10 people pointing at a video screen. You're going to have to get more clever.
That's not going to scale. Yeah.
You're going to have to get more clever. So the artificial intelligence for what we do, very specifically recognizing things, is pretty established. Now, if you say, well, what if we wanted to study people wrestling? Let's have 100 people mud wrestling. Yeah, we can't do that. That's not a solved problem. How do we recognize how people interact? Well, that's mostly using it, but it's not a solved problem. So we have this interesting balance. The artificial intelligence that says we're going to interpret behavior. Oh man, that's got a long ways to go.
Fair enough.
That's got a long ways to go.
And so one last
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah. So one last technical question. So what is your tech stack? I noticed on your website you're advertising for, I think, a junior developer position. What are the programming languages you use? What type of expertise is Theia generally looking for in talent, as you, if you have plans immediately, but over time building up your team?
All the product related code is C++.
C++, okay.
We try to stay away from any libraries. We try to stay away from, newly appearing or evolving. We just stick with the old C++. We do use Python for training neural networks because it's really common. But the neural network, when it's trained, and by training, it just says, if you've trained the neural network to do what we do, it takes an image and it spits something out. Yet people call it a black box. It's probably a little unfair to classify it as only a black box, but essentially you've trained it. It gives you the answer you want. The product, of course, is how do other people get that video image, and what do they do with the features that are identified? That's all C++. And do we do anything else? Yeah, no. And when we hire more developers, it will be because we finally figured our aha moment. when something's so data heavy, then data is everything, and the number of people required. So it's our interface, because it's so heavily data driven. The core of the interface is 6 buttons. One of them is loading data, and one of them is exporting data. So it's really 4 buttons. That's it. So we don't need a lot of interface development. And so it's kind of a funny position. Now, if we go all the way back to the beginning, we're gonna come to this crux, because I think this is something that other people are faced with. Do you have something that's truly scalable, or do you have something that falls more on the service side? If you fall more on the service side, providing service, helping someone, providing data, you're limited in how you can scale without massively hiring employees. If you go on the other side and you say we're going to be totally data-driven, totally algorithm-driven, you could scale enormously. The problem is that when does the software-only solution become viable? We don't know.
Fair enough. So is there a scenario where you could actually make your engine as an API if people could bring in images and have them access it that way? Yeah.
Technically, yes. Is that where we're going? Well, if you'd asked me 5 years ago when this all started, I said, yeah, when we got back to the days when it said something like Microsoft Inside, that's what I thought. And it turns out that it's taken so much more effort to convince people, so much more effort to get people excited, that we can't rely on other people to be evangelists for us. So it's kind of, that's also this threshold. What happens when there's this large core of people that are now our evangelists? Well, then we're going to have an aha moment going, ooh, we could be something different now.
But I think it'll be fascinating to see how that evolves as you go forward. As a programming note, I'd like to ask the audience, please feel free to put questions in the chats. We might be able to ask Scott as we approach the last 10, 15 minutes of our discussion. Scott, you've spent time down in the US, and now you're building this company in a beautiful little town called Kingston, Ontario. What are the comparison contrast? I actually had the benefit of working down in the US for about 10 years, and it just seems like risk is not such a four-letter word in the US as it is in Canada. Could you give us a compare and contrast, and how you see continuing to scale and grow this company in Kingston, which we hope you do? It sounds like you're committed to do that.
I'll give you my little sliver of the US. I grew up on the West Coast. So I showed up so when I graduated with my PhD, even before I graduated, really, I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. So I took a postdoc in computer animation in Switzerland. And I took a young family, a 1.5-year-old and an almost 4-year-old, and my wife to Europe. And we knew nobody. And there was no internet, so you couldn't talk to anyone. We had a 9-hour time change to back home, so you almost could not phone. And I went from there to Belgium. And in those days, it was really hard if you were in Europe to get a job in North America because of the time change. And nobody had heard of you. At least that was my impression. So I accepted a postdoctoral fellowship at Queen's University. I never heard of it. I know that's hard for Queen's people to believe, but I'd never heard of it. I'm from Vancouver. And showed up in Queen's, and the person I was working for drove up to her house, and this was Frances Richmond in physiology. And she has this old brick house on the corner of our park, looking at the courthouse and looking at the university. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. You get to live here. People used to make fun of her. For one of the things they made fun of is she had a bathtub in a big bedroom with a window that was low enough that she could lie in the bath and look at her office. So people made fun of her and said, that's probably what she does all the time. She lies in the bed and waits for her meeting to start and then walks over. And I thought, what a lifestyle. So I've been 2 years here. Loved it. And Fran said something prophetic at the time, but very unpleasant for me. She said, you're never going to be a scientist, Scott. You're never going to be one of the big boys. You're going to be the guy that stands between the scientists and the tools that they need to do science. And I went, I can't be a scientist. And so when the offer came to go to the National Institutes of Health as a scientist, see, I told you. So I went there. So I spent 4 years, and it was a fantastic place, intimidating as all get out. When I was there, it was 18,000 scientists on one campus, no students. And it was just research. But I saw how science was run. I saw how it worked, so to speak, from the inside. Who's listening to who? I learned the jargon and stuff. And I learned about the extramural research program. And when, after a couple of short jobs when I left there, I started a company. And I had a mentor from within. So I transferred software that wasn't from the lab I was in at the NIH. People always assume I was in that lab. I wasn't. I showed up and said, I need a job reference. Can you write a reference letter for me, Steve? And Steve said, well, why? I said, well, I quit my job. And he said, do you want to start a new company? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's no money, but you can write a grant. The US government will fund small businesses directly. You can write a grant and they will give you money to start your business. And I said, well, gee, that sounds all right. How do I go about doing that? I had no clue. And he said, well, you just write a grant. So he mentored me, but I spent a lot of time in the hallways of scientific officers at the NIH going, is this what you want? Is this what you want? Is this what you want? And I said, well, how long is this going to take? And he said, well, I don't know. Take about a year to get it funded. And I said, well, I have a family. He said, well, I mean, I can give you a small contract. And so I cobbled stuff together. But in the US, I don't think it's that uncommon. I don't know that it ever really occurred to me that there was the idea of failing. I might have to get a different job, but it never occurred to me that I'd fail. And I got funded, and the federal government in the US funded me for 6 years until we got our product out the door. And in return, they took no equity. So at the end of that funding, they expected me to have a product that would help the researchers that they were funding. And I think I did that. But that's all I asked for.
That's there's a lot of people in technology transfer that look at the SBIR program, I think as it's called now. Was that what it was called back then?
Yes.
When you funded, yeah. That it really is an interesting program to provide companies looking at building innovations to get across the innovation gap. Some people call it the valley of death. I'm not a big fan of that wording, but it's to take some early stage research that's at a relatively low technology readiness level and allow companies to incubate that technology to get it all the way to the marketplace.
Yeah, it was especially different after, because in fact, in order to be able to learn how to write those grants, they used to do an awful lot of grant reviews. And the NIH isn't like Canada, so it even at that time was $30 billion a year they gave away for research grants. So there's study sections all the time. I was reviewing grants. I felt always 3 or more times a year, I would review grants. And what they want.
Oops, we may have lost Scott's audio, at least I have. Nope, we still can't hear you, Scott. Ask our audience to give us a minute as we see if we can sort out the technical issue here.
How about that?
Oh, we can hear you, or at least I can hear you. Hopefully everybody else can.
Everybody believes I'm part of a technology company. I will say that when I was an undergrad, I spent my summers working as an installer of big switchboards for the phone company. And the last people that could run a phone back then were engineers too. So some things haven't changed. The SBIR process is extraordinary. So if you had a product for 2 people, but those 2 people were doing research that was so important to the NIH, that was enough to get you funded. It's probably changed a little bit over time. They now want to know your marketing strategy and so on. Back in the 90s, it was how important is it what you do to what we're trying to
Yep.
fund? And
Yep.
we need small companies. I think clinically, if you're working in the field of healthcare, um, companies drive the technology that the universities use, university hospitals,
Hmm.
because the hospitals, I don't think they should be using open source software. They're a hospital.
Yes, fair enough. Yeah.
So the healthcare depends on small companies, and that is how the NIH viewed it. Anything that's going to help healthcare or healthcare research is fair game to be funded by the US government directly. And the big difference between them there in Canada, the SBIR process was, of course, we worked with universities all the time because, the university investigators, they're grad students. They're still the guys that are collecting data, and there's still the people publishing it for all the reasons that Theia is dependent on them to some extent. We were too. The difference was the money was given to the company. And if the
Right.
university didn't do their job, we could cancel a contract.
Right. And so that very much led to C-Motion becoming the successful company that it is. And I assume
Oh yeah.
Theia experiments were funded through internal funding sources.
No,
Um,
Theo was funded NSERC and ORF
oh, wow. Okay.
in a
So
sense. At least
some
the
grants.
data
Yep.
that I'm saying I depend on my
Right.
relationship
Right. Right.
with Queen's University is through an ORF grant and through an NSERC grant and several NSERC Engage grants. So one CRD and several Engage grants.
So Scott, we just about 4 minutes left here. What are the challenges of growing this business in Kingston? Hopefully, you don't ever feel the pull of needing to move to a major center. I think from your website, it looks like you run a remote distributed team, at least in part. Uh, Talk about some of the challenges and how you plan to grow Thea as a big force, whether it's the 200 million or the $1 billion. Either
Well,
way, either of those.
I'll try to be quick here. C-Motion's always been virtual. So
Ah,
I'm
okay.
not sure that any employee at C-Motion lives in the same state or even in the same country. So we've been virtual for 20 years, really. And
So you've
so
been dealing with remote way before the pandemic.
yeah. So when the pandemic happened, going remote wasn't so foreign. Uh, it's if we can make it a software company, so that's what we can really get to. If we can drive it so it's scaling as software, we can stay here as well as anywhere else. And I like it here. If you get heavily, solutions provider and have to start dealing with cameras and have to start moving stuff, and you have employees everywhere that have to do installations and support it, then I don't know, maybe Kingston isn't big enough, but I'd like to think it is. The ecosystem here, the very end, I will say the ecosystem here. When I came back, I came back to Kingston. I bought a house in 97. My wife and I bought a house. Moved in 2003 because I couldn't figure out how to leave the US and keep C-Motion going. And we used to get together once a month, a handful of CEOs. It was kind of the tech ecosystem in Kingston. We'd get together, 6 or 7 of us, once a month, and just talk and say, what's it like to be here? Well, a couple of weeks ago, there was a new CEO came to town. He said, I'd like to meet people. And Dan Desjardins says, well, Dan doesn't mince words. He's not about to organize anything. He says, my place, March 3rd, 5:30, who's coming? And there are 40 or 50 of us now. So this ecosystem in Kingston is growing. It's very cool. And some of them are really, really dear friends of mine. So they don't want to leave either. So there's some of us kind of holding on to each other. We don't want to move.
Yeah, well, I think that's important as the CEO of a company to have a forum to speak with other leaders where you can talk about challenges, opportunities, et cetera, in a way that maybe you don't need to talk to your team about, or you'll talk to your team about it other times, but maybe then there's new ideas or you cross with new networks. So we have
Yeah, yeah.
Kingston has quietly got quite a strong entrepreneurial group of people.
But I want to give credit to Queens and your organization, Jim. The outreach that the university does now, and particularly industrial relations, the outreach that you've given to the small companies astounded me. When someone says, really, really, Scott, you should talk to him. I say, yeah, I talked to him 20 years ago. And then I talked again. It was, oh my goodness,
Right.
what's going on here? This is fantastic. So I want to give you guys full credit. You're organizing this, and it's what you've created in the last few years is amazing for a small
Well,
company.
thank you, Scott. I mean, I think it's fun for everybody on our teams, and it's not just our office. There's other. The nice thing about the city of Kingston and the region is that it's small enough that all the groups that support innovation work together. You couldn't picture that being able to happen in Toronto or other places. So really appreciate your thoughts on that. So, Scott, I think we're at time. I want to say a heartfelt thanks for sharing your experience with Theia and your journey thus far. I think everybody on the audience will now be following Theia, I hope, to see what direction your journey takes. It's certainly going upwards. It's a question of how steep and how far you plan to go, but sounds like your future looks bright. So really appreciate you taking the time, and I'd love to have you share any concluding remarks you might have.
Oh, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity. It's really weird to sit and talk about me more than talking about the company, but I appreciate everybody listening. And anybody who wants to contact, yeah, feel free. I always like to talk.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. We'll let you go. And everybody, please don't forget there's a networking session following this. Okay, well, everybody, thanks so much. This was Startup Grind brought to you by Spark Center. Uh, as a programming note, the next Startup Grind is going to be taking place on Thursday, March 31st. Stay tuned to social media for more details and how to register. Lastly, wanted to mention that Spark Center puts out a quarterly magazine called Spark, Business and Innovation Magazine. And if you'd like to receive a free print or digital copy of the upcoming spring issue, 2022, please be sure to subscribe at the sparkmagazine.ca. So now it's time for networking. If you wish to join us, you can navigate to this section by clicking the icon on the left side of your screen. You'll be paired up with one person at a time for 3 minutes. You can use this time to get to know each other, and you'll have the option to extend the session if desired. Once the time is up, press ready, and Hopin will automatically move you to the next person. Click Connect button if you'd like to exchange contact information with anyone. Really appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to hear the story of Theia Markerless. And thanks, and we look forward to seeing you in the networking session.